2008. Carrington Training Ground, half empty, that early morning grey hanging over the pitches. Alex Ferguson pulls Rio Ferdinand right off the session. Doesn't say why, doesn't explain a thing. Just stops him, points across the grass at a kid wearing the number 7, and says it plain. Look at this kid. He's the best I've ever seen. Think about that for a second. This is a man who'd coached Cristiano Ronaldo, coached Rooney, coached Beckham, coached Scholes. And here he is, telling Rio Ferdinand, telling him straight, that some academy kid, not even out of his teens yet, was better than every single one of them. Rio believed it almost on sight, but then he actually looked at the boy, locked eyes with him. And something else crept in, something Ferguson had clocked too, something he never quite found the words for. The talent? Undeniable. You could see it from across the pitch. But the eyes looked empty, like nobody was home in there. His name was Ravel Morrison. Over the next 10 years, he'd turn out for 14 different clubs, across 6 different countries. This is the story of why. Before any of that, before he was a footballer at all, he was just a kid with nothing underneath him. No stable ground. His dad walked out when he was a baby, gone. His mum, that relationship had been broken for as long as he could even remember, cracked from the start. The one place that ever felt safe, the one place that felt like home, was his grandparents' house. Football, though, football made sense to him. Down at Fletcher Moss Rangers, his local club, coaches couldn't stop talking about him. They genuinely believed this kid could be the next David Beckham. There was a trial at Manchester City, but it fell apart before he even turned 9. His mum couldn't always get him there on time, and on the pitch, if a teammate tackled him too hard, he'd get physical right back. Then Manchester United scouts saw him. 6 weeks, that's all it took. 6 weeks from a scout watching him play to United pulling him into the academy. And the scout didn't hold back either, called him the new Ronaldinho, said he was the standout kid out of thousands he'd watched. But even back then, something about him sat differently from the other boys. He didn't drink, didn't go out, mostly just rode his BMX around the neighborhood, alone, for hours. He'd turn up late to training like time didn't really apply to him. And he was in constant pain, his teeth were rotting, genuinely rotting, and he was so terrified of dentists that the club had to physically drive him there themselves. Nobody around him had the words yet for what they were actually looking at. The day Morrison turned 17, United handed him his first professional contract. Part of the thinking, you sense, was just to give some kind of structure to a life that had never really had any. 48 hours later, 2 days, he's arrested. 2 counts of witness intimidation. Here's what happened. Some of his friends, the ones who'd loiter around the edges of training sessions, robbed someone at knife point. The victim went to the police. And in response, 15 people turned up outside that family's house, on their front lawn, threatening more violence, smashing windows in. The family was so frightened they put the house on the market and left the city for good. When it got to court, the judge sent Morrison's mates down. Morrison himself walked away with a 12-month referral order and a warning ringing in his ears. Next time, you're in the cell right next to them. And here's the part almost nobody ever brings up. Not one person from Manchester United showed up to that hearing. Not one. Then, during the case, something else surfaced. The on-duty psychologist found Morrison had been diagnosed with severe ADHD, and that United had actually pulled him off his medication after the FA wouldn't grant an exception for what counted as a banned substance. So picture that. A 16-year-old, untreated ADHD. No father around. Friends who carried knives. That's the real context sitting underneath a label that was about to chase him for the rest of his career. Trouble. What came next, over the following 12 months, should have flipped the whole story on its head. Morrison started training with the first team. Word got round the building about him nutmegging senior professionals, not once, 3 times in the same minute. By October, Ferguson had him marked as one of the 5 brightest kids in the whole academy and handed him his first team debut. The next morning, Morrison turned up at Ferguson's office with a handwritten letter, just to thank him for the chance. Ferguson said later he was gobsmacked, genuinely caught off guard. Underneath it all, this was a kid with a good heart. He'd just been shaped, hard, by everything around him. Then came the FA Youth Cup. The one competition United cared about above almost everything else. The tournament that gave English football the Busby Babes, the class of '92. Morrison's lined up alongside Paul Pogba and Jesse Lingard, and even in that company, it's Morrison that Wayne Rooney points to as a level above the rest. And he delivers. The winner against Newcastle in the last 16. The opener against Chelsea in the semi-final. Then the final against Sheffield United. Scoreline level, tension thick in the air, and Morrison scores the first goal himself, wins the penalty for the second, walks away player of the match. For one tournament, just one, Ravel Morrison looked exactly like everything they'd said he was. 2 days. That's all it took after the final for Morrison to be back in court, convicted of criminal damage for throwing his girlfriend's phone out a window during an argument. On its own, compared to everything before it, that's small, minor even. But this time the press wouldn't let it go. One paper called him the shame of Manchester United, straight up. Reporters kept hounding club staff for a quote until somebody finally cracked and gave them exactly the line they were fishing for. He can do whatever he wants. He's a waste of space. And once that line was out there, the digging started. Old stories about police visits to his grandparents' house, rumors about stolen training gear, anything, basically, that slotted neatly into the story that had already been written about him long before any of this. Ferguson, to his credit, kept fighting it. Turned down interest from Newcastle, Arsenal, Chelsea, even Barcelona and PSG came calling. But then his 25th anniversary press conference as United manager rolls around, an occasion that should have been pure celebration. And what's he getting asked about? Morrison's latest Twitter outburst. You can hear the exhaustion in his answer. There's always something with him. Every day there's something new. On deadline day, United sold him to West Ham, for a fraction of what he was worth. Sam Allardyce promised to get him out of Manchester, give him a fresh start somewhere new. Ferguson would later write in his own autobiography that some players just aren't emotionally equipped to overcome the wounds of their childhood, and that letting Morrison go was one of the most painful decisions of his entire career. Morrison was 20 years old. What followed from there set the pattern for the rest of his career. On repeat. A month into the West Ham deal, he's fined for a homophobic slur thrown out during a Twitter argument. Then, on a club trip out to Eastern Europe, with staff already worried about a possible eating disorder, they watch him refuse the local food entirely and live off chocolate bars he'd packed from home. For days. He's loaned out to Birmingham and somehow manages to baffle his own teammates by not even knowing who Paul Gascoigne was, the exact player his manager kept telling him he could become. 2 months into that loan, the Birmingham players are actually pushing the club to send him back early. And then, right when it looks done, he comes out swinging. Man of the match. A stunning volley a month later, good enough that by the end of the season, Allardyce himself is demanding West Ham bring him back. Back at West Ham, he scores 4 goals in a single month. One of them's a solo run straight through the entire Tottenham defense, good enough to win him the club's goal of the season. 9 days after that, out for England's under-21s, he scores again, leaving 2 defenders sat on the floor behind him. For a moment, just a moment, there's genuine talk that Roy Hodgson might take him to the 2014 World Cup. That was his best shot. Best shot he'd ever get to rewrite the whole story. And then it just collapses. An agent botches a transfer attempt to Fulham that sets off a legal dispute between West Ham and a rival club. And the fallout wrecks Morrison's relationship with his own team in the process. Loaned out again. Left out of a playoff final he should have started. And then, weeks later, arrested again. 2 counts of assault, this time against his girlfriend and her mother. He was cleared of all of it, every charge. But by then, it didn't matter anymore. The story had already been written long before any verdict came in. What came after that reads less like a football career and more like a man searching for somewhere, anywhere, to belong. Italy, Spain, Mexico, Sweden, the Netherlands. 6 clubs in 7 years, new dressing room after new dressing room, a different language every single time, and never once staying long enough to actually settle into any of them. Somewhere along that road, he opened up about the isolation nobody else could see. It's different for men, he said. No one comes out and listens to you. And the eating, the disordered eating that had started years before, only got worse. I don't know if it's a mental thing, he admitted, but in my head, I kept telling myself I couldn't eat. Then, in 2020, 2 whole decades after Ferguson first stood on that training ground and called him the best kid he'd ever seen, Morrison finally made his senior international debut. Not for England. Not for the country whose academy system had raised him from the age of 9. For Jamaica instead, through family heritage he'd never before had the chance to represent. It'd be easy. Too easy. To tell this whole thing as a simple story about wasted talent. Plenty of people already have. Tweets, headlines, pub conversations, all landing on the same lazy verdict. But that version skips right past the parts that actually explain any of it. Skips the father who walked out before Morrison was even old enough to remember his face. Skips the 16-year-old with diagnosed ADHD, denied his own medication by the very rules of the sport that was supposed to be raising him. Skips the club that never bothered sending a single person to court, the one time he genuinely needed someone in his corner. And it skips the people who actually knew him. Ferguson, Rio Ferdinand, the coaches who fought tooth and nail to keep him close. All of them, right to the very end, said the exact same thing. The talent was never, ever the question. The real question was whether anyone around him, the academy, the clubs, the sport itself, had the first idea how to hold on to a gift that big when it showed up wrapped in a childhood like his. They didn't. And Ravel Morrison spent the next 16 years finding that out, one club at a time. Ferguson called him the best kid he'd ever seen, and Rio Ferdinand believed it the second he actually watched him play. 14 clubs later, most of the football world's forgotten his name completely. This channel exists for exactly that reason, to remember players like Ravel Morrison. The ones football built up, hyped to the moon, and then never figured out how to actually hold on to. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. And down in the comments, I want to know what you actually think. Did Morrison waste his own talent? Or did football waste him first? See you in the next one.